Hello, hello, hello. All right. So, we're continuing on with our week about the 1850s. Today, we're going to talk about John Brown. And um, we'll leave it at that right now. So, your key point for the day is just John Brown. All right. So, John was born on May the 9th, 1800, in Torrington, Connecticut. All right. Um, in his youth, they would move out to the frontier. Now, this is the Northwest Territory during the early 1800s. This is places like Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, that whole area. They would move out there um, where they were some of the few whites and were surrounded by Native Americans. Um, John and his father and the family as a whole took to the Native Americans and really liked them and treated them as equals and as people, unlike the large majority of Americans during that time. The Browns viewed them as friends, allies, and trading partners. Um, so at this point, John was hanging out with the Native Americans a lot. He spent most of his time in the woods and shepherding. He loved lives. He loved sheep, cows. He loved animals, and he spent most of his time with his native friends and the animals. Uh, this is the environment he grew up in. His father was a tanner and a very hard worker, and also extremely religious. And he was also a very fervent abolitionist. John would pick both of those things up from his dad. John was extremely religious his entire life and also a hardcore abolitionist his entire life. So, while he was out there at the ripe old age of 12, he took a herd of cows 100 miles to market on his own, just him and these cows. So he took all these cows to a market 100 miles away, came back. Um, Pretty impressive for a 12-year-old. Also, as he grew up, he would resemble his father, and that he too would become a tanner. He would stay a shepherd. He was fascinated with livestock his entire life. He'd also try his hand at farming. He would open up a utopian society for everybody and anybody, African Americans, whites, in an area called New Elba, New York. He was an activist. He promoted women's rights, he promoted African American rights and the end of slavery. And also, some consider him a terrorist, and some a patriot. We'll get into that as we go along. But an important thing to focus on here about John is that he's not just anti slavery. There were a lot of people in America that were anti slavery, but that didn't mean they cared anything about African Americans. But John was different. John saw all people as equals. So not only was he anti slavery and believed slavery was evil, but he also believed that African Americans were the same as white Americans, and so were Native Americans. He viewed all people as equals. And as you'll see in his adult life, he saw women that way too. So John was an extreme radical for the time. He believed in the equality of humankind, which is pretty much during the time unheard of in society. So, with this, let's continue on. With Brown, uh, he would become leaders, a leader in whatever town or community he moved into. He was an extremely hard worker, and as his life progressed, he would end up with two wives. Um, let's see, about 16 kids. I think it's either 13 or 16. but he had kids all the way into the teens, about even with each wife. And at varying times in his life, he would lose a lot of these children due to disease and fighting for freedom. John, over time, would not be that good at business because he wouldn't keep it simple. He was good as a tanner or a shepherd and just working with things like that. But when he tried to get bigger and bigger and make more and more money, he would invest more and more, and these large scale ventures would fail him miserably. And throughout his his adult years, he was destitute. Not only was he a promoter of the ideas of equality of all human beings, he was also a kind of an enemy to capitalism. He really, really did not like how capitalism took advantage of people. At different times, he worked on creating trade groups and a organization where people could get goods, get things to sell, to get things they need at a standardized, decent price, which this kind of idea doesn't lead him to be successful in American history in the system of capitalism. It's one of the problems with his businesses. He did not look at it as making money. He looked at it as providing a service. But he was, like I said, always anti-slave and pro-rights for all people. And as he'd get older and older, this would rest heavy on him more and more. And finally, in the 1850s, he decided to pledge the rest of his life to ending this. He decided that the end of slavery would be something to fight for, and if necessary, die for. So this starts with Kansas. All right. Two of his older sons had moved to Kansas to help make it a free state. All right. And as we talked with the first lecture with the impending crisis, Kansas had free staters and lots of people coming over from Missouri to try to make it slave. So you have this rivalry, and the Missourians that were coming over voting and pushing for Kansas to be slave tended to be extremely violent and killed a lot of free staters. And John was appalled by this. Not that the slave state people are, as they're usually referred to in history books, Missouri ruffians. All right. Not only were they coming over and killing, that didn't bother John, because you'll see why. What bothered him was that the free state people, the people that were against slavery, trying to make Kansas a free state, weren't fighting back. His sons grew up with him, and they sent him a letter saying they needed his help. They needed him to raise money and bring weapons for the free state cause. And this is what he'd dedicate the rest of his life to. All right. One of the things that you'll notice about John and his children were involved in all of these later escapades. He was extremely, extremely close to his kids. He was a very doting father. In the beginning, he seemed to be very harsh. He took the idea of save the rod, spoil the child idea in old school Christianity. But very quickly, he learned he didn't like this, and he didn't feel this was right. And John was the one that took care of all of them when they were sick, when they got typhoid or diphtheria. scarlet fever, any horrid disease, he'd stay up days taking care of his kids. He was also very close to his kids in that, he'd read stories to them, he'd talk to them. He really influenced their views on the world. They would grow up seeing all people as equal like he did. And they would all be activists as well. Um, with John and his kids, with all of this going on, like I said, his oldest were in Kansas, right? And they needed his help. So he dropped everything, raised money, got guns, and went to Kansas. When he got there, he was even more upset that people weren't fighting back. So he organized he would end up leading what would become known as the Liberty Guard. And this would kind of kick off what's known as Bleeding Kansas to a very big degree. He would show up in Lawrence to help the Free Soilers, to help these anti-slavery people try to organize and fight back. In Lawrence, these Missouri border ruffians came over and killed people and killed the leaders of the Free State movement in Lawrence. They chopped them up and it left a mess. It was a horrible scene. So when John got there with the supplies and the guns and everything, when he saw this, he jumped right in and get involved. He would really work towards this. He would become one of the major leaders of the Free State movement and the Free State military in Kansas. He was not going to let these slave owners and their minions, in his eyes, he was not going to give them fear. He was going to give them death. That's how he saw it. So, he and a few of his choice men from the Liberty Guard would go to Pottawatomie Creek. Pottawatomie Creek is where a lot of these slave owners had set up shop. And these not only were the major slave owners from Missouri and moving into the area to try to take over, to push for slavery, they are the ones that came in and were the leaders of the Lawrence Massacre, so to speak, the Lawrence Affair. So he went to Pottawatomie Creek. He would go to several different houses, bring out the fathers and sons that had participated in it, and chop them to pieces with their swords. And he would leave this bloody massacre and become famous throughout the nation in this Pottawatomie Creek massacre. Some people always called him Pottawatomie Brown or Pottawatomie John Brown. But this would continue. Once he got involved in this fighting, he would stay and fight. He was involved in the Battle of Blackjack, which he won against way superior forces. And he was also involved in the Battle of Osawatomie. With this, involving this and fighting, by the end of 1856, there'd be more than 200 dead in Kansas due to this war between free staters and slave staters. And this is really the birth of his myth. All right. By this point, after the massacre, the Pottawatomie Creek debacle, the Battle of Blackjack, the Battle of Osawatomie, Brown became a mythic figure in the Northeast. He became a patriot. He became a crusader for liberty, and people started regarding him like they did the Founding Fathers. So he became a big deal in the North, and many people started referring to him as the modern Moses. By this point, his hair had almost gone all white, and he had this huge, long beard that was solid white. And this is the birth of the myth of this idea of John Brown the Patriot. But also, we have the birth of the idea of John Brown the murderer and terrorist. This has been a big argument throughout American history. Was he a patriot and freedom fighter, or was he America's first major terrorist, domestic terrorist, to put it in today's ideas? In the North, he was looked at as a Moses figure, as somebody that was going to set people free. In the South, however, he was looked at as a terrorist, a murderer, and was vilified. So, Brown fights in Kansas, stays there for quite a while. After this, though, he decided that Kansas was not enough, that he would never solve things by a local thing. And this is an idea that he had had his entire adult life. He'd even told some of his kids about this idea. He wanted to raid Harper's Ferry and a gun-making factory near it. Upriver, you'd have this gun factory that made all the weapons. They would go down to Harper's Ferry where they'd be stored. This was the biggest ammunition and weapons depot in America at the time. This was in Northwest Virginia, what we now consider to be West Virginia. All right. So his plan was to go to Harper's Ferry, take as many weapons as he could, have the local slaves freed, and he was thinking they would join his cause, and then they would go set others free. And when the heat would get too much, they would retreat into the Appalachian Mountains. He knew the woods very well. He knew how to survive in the wilderness. So what he was going to do is make old-fashioned Indian forts, set up Indian traps and Indian guerrilla warfare for these white slave owners. So this was the idea, guerrilla warfare against the Southerners, coming in and out of the mountains and woods, hitting them, freeing the slaves, and continuing on. And he believed that after a time, he would have a large enough army of African Americans to sweep through the South and free all African Americans. That was his ultimate goal. All right. So he, like I said, he had been planning this, working on this, thinking about this his entire adult life. But he was, for the most part, distracted with trying to survive and take care of his kids. Then Kansas happened, and he got so involved in Kansas. Most of his kids were old enough, not all, but between his second wife and the older kids, everything was taken care of, and he went on this crusade to Kansas. When he decided Kansas wouldn't be enough to make a difference, this is when he decided to really go through with his Harper's Ferry plan. All right. So, this became the focus. It took him several years to organize and plan, get the men for it. Two of his older sons would join him for this. Three of his sons would join him for this. Two of them would die. One of them would escape. But this group he pulled together, these revolutionaries, as he would say, or activists, or terrorists, however you want to look at it. He created a biracial, both African American and white Americans, pulled together, 22 of them, to attack Harper's Ferry and to attack the gun factory and to start freeing slaves around the Harper's Ferry area. If you remember, supposedly Prosser's Rebellion, the Nat Turner Rebellion, and several other rebellions had happened in that Northampton County of North Virginia. And with this, he was thinking this would be the prime place because of that and the easy access to the woods and mountains. So this biracial group show up at Harper's Ferry. They easily take Harper's Ferry. They easily take the gun factory. The others move around and easily free a large number of slaves in the local area. And for the most part, the slaves did not join him. They fled. So his idea of freeing them, arming them, and fighting flopped. Most of them fled or stayed, ran off into the woods and then came back to the plantations. This really wouldn't register to him. He thought with this religious zeal that these people would come and fight for freedom. And that wasn't the case. So they had taken the factory, they had taken Harper's Ferry, and freed quite a few people right there in the Harper's Ferry area. But nobody was coming to join this revolution. All of these guys that were with Brown tried to convince him, okay, well, we've got 3 huge wagons full of weapons and ammunition. We just need to take off, go into the mountains, escape before things get bad, and then start raiding plantations and seeing if we can build this army in a slower fashion. Brown decided that no, they weren't going anywhere. He wanted this to start then. And it's very possible that he really kind of got the idea that this was not going to happen and that he was going to make his last stand right here at Harper's Ferry, fight to the death. So instead of fleeing, Brown pulled in as many men and called as many men as he could to come to Harper's Ferry, and the battle begins. Local militias are formed. All right. I'll give you an idea. Time frame is October the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th. All right. It's in 1859. So on the night of the 16th, that's when they go out. That's when they take the factory, Harper's Ferry, the munitions, and go around and take several slave plantations. By the 18th, they're working, getting everything organized, getting everything done, getting the wagons loaded, waiting for the slaves to show up to fight and win freedom. By the end of that 17th, it's not looking good. That's when his men start asking him to run. He decides not to. And by the morning of the 18th, it's too late. They are completely surrounded by local militia groups. These guys show up with their weapons and just start shooting. As the day goes on, those militia groups that were surrounding were just completely drunk and used everything and anything they could put in their guns to shoot down at the people in Harper's Ferry. And John would lose a lot of men. All in all, between fighting with the militia group and the American Marines that would come in and take him, he would lose 10 of his men. All right. 10 of his men would die fighting at Harper's Ferry. 5 of them would escape, and one of those that escaped was one of his sons. And the other 7 would be captured, tried, convicted, and hung. So, let's talk about this. All right, now that they're surrounded and trapped and can't get out, Brown decides to fight to the bitter end. They are shooting back and fighting against the militias. Anytime the militia comes in, they slaughter them. All right, so while all this is going on, one of his sons gets shot in the gut and would spend the last the last day basically dying. The son was in severe pain and was calling out to his dad and asking his dad to kill him. And Brown looked at his son and said, "Die like a man," and went back to shooting out of the place they had fortified. That is, he's a hard guy. With this, finally, on the 19th, the American Marines would be sent in to take it back. And the colonel that were leading the Marines to take John Brown was none other than Robert E. Lee. Of course, most of you have probably heard of Robert E. Lee because of the Civil War. He was one of the most famous generals of the Confederacy. He was also considered, before secession, to be one of America's best generals and most important military leaders. But he would go with the South in secession. So when the Marines come in, he would also have with him his second in command, Jeb Stuart, which would become another famous general in the Civil War that was a Confederate as well. So Lee would send in Stuart and ask for them to surrender. Brown would refuse to surrender numerous times and keep fighting. And finally, the Marines would charge and take the location that they were fortified in. That's where numerous of John Brown's people died, and John Brown would be run through with a sword and severely beaten. But he would be one of the 7 that would be captured at Harper's Ferry. They would take him in, and this is where John Brown became mythic, really big, everywhere. This is for his trial. With what he did at Harper's Ferry, every American knew who he was. And if they were anti-slave, they were for him. If they were pro-slave, they hated him. So, in October and November, he would be tried very quickly. All right. He would be in severe pain because he got run through and he was beaten so badly. When he was in jail, they kept tending to him. When he was on trial, he was actually in a hospital bed in the courtroom. His lawyers that were given to him, because it's the U.S., tried to get him to convince him to do that he's not guilty by reason of insanity. They wanted to use that defense for him. And he said, "No, there's no way I'll do this. I'm not insane. I know what I'm doing. I wanted to do this, and I would do it again. I am trying to free the American people." So he would continue and refuse to do this. The lawyers didn't know what to do. The first day in court, John Brown fired them and told the judge, "Forget it. I'm not going to get a fair trial here. I know what's going to happen. Convict me, execute me, and get it over with." But in that time, from late October through that first early part of November, he became famous even in the South. And even Southerners loved what he represented, in that they saw him as a real man, as a man that would fight and die for a cause. He was highly intelligent. He was a very good conversationalist. He was very charming. And he knew what he believed, and he was going to die for it. So a lot of the Southerners, the governor of Virginia even, really respected him and liked him. But he was guilty of treason and murder in the eyes of the status quo, in the eyes of the American government. So he would be convicted, and they would decide to hang him and his 6 others that were captured. So, They would execute them in early November, fairly quickly. During this time, he was interviewed by a lot of newspapers, northern and southern. He wrote a lot of letters to people and newspapers, everybody else, explaining why he did it, what he did it for, to promote and keep the fight against slavery alive. Um, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who we talked about, was one of the major players in the Transcendentalist movement, said when he was interviewed, John Brown will make the gallows as glorious as Christ made the cross. So, to these Northerners, he becomes a martyr for a cause of freedom. He's seen as a true patriot. But in the South, he is viewed as a terrorist, as a murderer, as an example of what the North will do and how far they will go to end the institution of slavery that the South doesn't want to let go of. So, with this, Brown would be executed on December the 2nd, 1859. They would lead him out in chains. They would want, so he wouldn't run off. But Brown would convince them not to lead him, not to chain him. He said he would go peacefully. He was going to die for this. So what he did was he jumped up and sat on the wagon that was carrying the coffin that they would put him in. And he sat there straight, looking at everybody around him as he rode on his coffin to the gallows. All right. With this, he would be executed. All right. Numerous people would see this execution. They would sneak in to see this execution. And this would become this event with Harper's Ferry, his execution. He himself would become one of the major pushes towards civil war. The South no longer looked at the North as weak and effeminate. They saw that people like Brown in the North did exist and would fight tooth and nail against slavery. And many historians believe that this was that final straw, this final push to secession and war. So, Brown, the night before his execution, wrote his last will and testament. All right. So, I'm going to read it for you. Just a part of it. All right. A quote from it. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. I had as of now thought, vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. Then he went on to say, but now I see no other course but blood like a river, to purge this land of an evil. So what he's saying, Brown believed that he could do this slowly, easily, without much death on both sides. But with his capture, with his trial, he knew that it was going to take a major event. An event that would kill numerous Americans and drench the country in blood. Most people don't call this his final words or his will. They call it the prophecy of John Brown. Right there, many say he predicted the Civil War. So with that, we have Brown. We have what some people would call an American terrorist. Some people call an American freedom fighter. What do you think? Right? Throughout, what we're going to wrap up with is how he's been viewed. All right? Like I told you earlier, terrorist, murderer, freedom fighter, martyr. He was glorified as something bigger than life by both the South and the North in the 1800s. By the time of the 1900s, people like in the, well, historians like in the Dunning School, which we talked about in the Old South, that would shape this myth of the Old South, and most people would think it was the history of the Old South, which it isn't. They would also shape how people saw Brown. In most American history textbooks throughout the 20th century, Brown is looked at as a crazy man. All right? Why was he considered to be crazy in the textbooks of the 20th century? And of Southern, because, how Southerners viewed him during the 1800s. Why was he crazy? Well, it was simple. They said that insanity, the prosecuting lawyer said there was insanity ran in his family, which isn't true. He had an aunt that was committed, that was deemed insane, but she was not related to him by blood. She was related to him by marriage. But the prosecutor would latch onto this and say that insanity ran in his family, so John Brown was insane and dangerous to everyone. Brown refused to do anything, say anything, because he said this was a made-up trial. He already knew what was going to happen before it was happening. So this gets used. The historians of the early 20th century that wrote most of the textbooks originally started pushing that, John Brown was insane. He had it in his family line, and he finally went over the edge and did all these things. And what this does, and you can see how people shape and twist history. Whether you think he's insane or not, to die for a cause is up to you. You read through it, look at the facts, see what you think. But it's disingenuous history, right? That early 20th century historians, most of them Southern, most of them grandsons and great-grandsons of Confederates, would write histories of the Old South and of Brown saying that he was insane and it ran in his family. So most 20th century Americans that were in this new modern public education system would learn growing up that you have crazy John Brown. And most of the textbooks through most of the 20th century, all the way up into the 1980s, would refer to him as crazy John Brown. This plays a role in twisting and perverting history because it doesn't just say John Brown. You don't see them use that kind of language with the British or the Native Americans or anybody else that the Americans were fighting. But to have an American do this, they would take it and shape it in the way they wanted it to be presented. So Brown, in many American history textbooks, would be characterized as crazy John Brown. To kind of give you guys an idea of how this affects how people viewed him throughout the 20th century, you've probably heard of the Black Panther movement. It's a black nationalist movement that we'll get into in U.S. history too. All right. The Black Panthers were notorious for not wanting white people to help with anything. Not money, not support. All they wanted was separate black communities and for white people to stay away so they could live their own lives. They were tired of being oppressed and killed by the status quo. They just wanted their own world. So the reporters just wouldn't let it go. They didn't understand because many of the reporters were like the college kids of the time that wanted to help and wanted to push for equality. Remember, this is during the era of the civil rights. So when asked, the Black Panthers, when asked, it's like the Black Panthers said, no, we don't want anything from white people, and white people can't help us. We need our own. We need to do our own thing. And she'd say, but we can help. The press was always pushing this, and it's like um, one of the most famous responses was from Newton. He said, "No, there's never been a white person in America that did anything good for an African American." And one of the reporters would say, "But what about John Brown?" And Newton would reply, "That's just some crazy effing cracker." So you can kind of get it, right? See what I'm getting at? By through education, people have been taught civic religion. That's what I've been talking about from the start. Whether he's a terrorist or a patriot, whether he's a murderer or a freedom fighter, the story should be told through evidence, through facts, not through slander. Like I told you at the beginning, trying to heroify or vilify anyone is a way to get really, really bad history. What you want to do is look at the facts and go from there. Not have a belief and base your argument on that. So this is one of the ways I like to, as we're coming to the end of things in this class, to really make you guys and gals really think about what you're being told, what you read, and to think critically and do the research and see what you think. See what the evidence leads you to think about this. Belief has no role in a functioning society. It should be based on fact and reason. So, with that, we have John Brown and his interesting legacy. Everybody have a good day, and we'll continue on with the ideas of race and racism in the 17 and 1800s for our next lecture. All right, goodbye.